Imagine this. You are standing in the shadows of the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill in Rome, and the year is 65 after Christ. Your hands tremble as you clutch a scroll containing the most dangerous secret in the empire. Through the marble corridors, you can hear the haunting melody of a lyre echoing from the emperor's private chambers. But tonight the music carries an undertone of madness that chills your blood. You are Gaius Nymphidius Sabinus, Praetorian prefect, and what you've discovered will shake the foundations of Roman civilization. Emperor Nero, the man who burned Christians as human torches and murdered his own mother, has made a decision so twisted, so unprecedented, that it defies every tradition Rome has held sacred for 8 centuries. He has chosen his heir, but this successor isn't a blood relative, a seasoned general, or even a Roman citizen. The footsteps approaching in the corridor belong to a boy barely 13 years old, with painted eyes and silk robes that cost more than a legion's annual salary. His name is Sporus, and until 3 months ago he was just another beautiful slave in the emperor's collection. Now he wears the purple stripe of imperial authority and a golden diadem that once belonged to Augustus himself. What you don't know yet is that this child will become the most powerful person in the known world through methods so disturbing that Roman historians will spend centuries trying to erase the evidence. But the nightmare you're about to witness goes deeper than political succession. Nero hasn't just chosen an heir, he's created a human replacement for someone he lost, someone whose absence drove him to madness. The emperor's grief has transformed into an obsession so complete, so consuming, that he's willing to destroy the Roman Empire itself rather than face reality. Tonight you'll discover how love becomes possession, how grief becomes violence, and how absolute power corrupts not just the ruler, but everyone who enables his descent into madness. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten chapter where imperial Rome collided with unthinkable personal obsession, if you enjoyed learning about the buried truths of history, consider hitting that subscribe button. These voices from the shadows of power deserve to be heard, and there are countless more stories waiting to emerge from history's darkest archives. Your support helps preserve these testimonies that reveal the full spectrum of human experience, no matter how disturbing. The story begins not with Sporus, but with Poppaea Sabina, the most beautiful woman in Rome and the only person Nero ever truly loved. You need to understand their relationship to comprehend the madness that followed her death, because what happened between them established patterns of obsession and control that would define everything Nero did afterward. Picture yourself in the imperial villa at Antium in the summer of 62 after Christ. The Mediterranean sun streams through silk curtains as Poppaea reclines on a couch inlaid with ivory and gold. Her skin is flawless, maintained through daily baths in donkey's milk and honey masks, prepared by a team of Greek slaves who understand the science of beauty. Her hair, arranged in elaborate curls that take hours to perfect, catches the light like spun gold. But it's her eyes that capture you, intelligent and calculating, the eyes of a woman who understands exactly how to wield her beauty as a weapon. Nero sits beside her, completely transfixed. This is not the cruel emperor who orders executions with casual indifference. This is a man transformed by love into something approaching vulnerability. He feeds her grapes with his own hands, listens to her opinions on matters of state, and writes poetry comparing her beauty to Venus herself. For the first time in his life, Nero has found someone whose approval matters more than absolute power. But Poppaea Sabina is not content to be merely a mistress. She wants to be empress, and that means removing Nero's current wife, Octavia, daughter of the late Emperor Claudius. The political implications are staggering. Octavia represents legitimacy, the connection to the Julio-Claudian dynasty that gives Nero's rule constitutional authority. Divorcing her would be politically disastrous, but Poppaea's influence over the emperor grows stronger every day. You watch as she employs techniques of psychological manipulation, so subtle, so sophisticated, that they would impress modern relationship experts. She never demands directly, instead planting ideas and letting Nero believe they originated in his own mind. She alternates between passionate devotion and calculated coldness, keeping him constantly off balance and desperate for her approval. When he gives her gifts, expensive jewelry or rare perfumes from the far reaches of the empire, she accepts them with the air of someone who deserves such tribute, never expressing gratitude that might suggest she needs his generosity. The turning point comes during a dinner party in the palace. Octavia, pale and nervous, sits at the emperor's right hand in the position protocol demands for the empress, but Poppaea has arranged to arrive late, making an entrance that draws every eye in the room. She wears a gown of silk so fine it's almost transparent, dyed with Tyrian purple that costs more than most Romans earn in a lifetime. Her jewelry includes pearls from Britain, emeralds from Egypt, and a necklace of Indian diamonds that Nero personally selected from the tribute of conquered nations. As she takes her place at a couch near the emperor, Nero's attention shifts completely away from his wife. He begins addressing his comments to Poppaea, seeking her reaction to the entertainment, asking her opinion on the wine selection, treating her as if she were the empress while Octavia sits forgotten. The humiliation is public and deliberate, a signal to Rome's elite that power dynamics in the imperial household have fundamentally changed. But Poppaea's triumph carries the seeds of future tragedy. Her demand for recognition, her refusal to remain hidden as a mere concubine, creates the very visibility that will eventually destroy her. By insisting on public acknowledgement of her relationship with Nero, she makes herself a target for every enemy of the emperor, every rival for power, every person who benefits from political instability. The marriage ceremony between Nero and Poppaea, which takes place after he divorces and murders Octavia, is the most lavish celebration Rome has ever witnessed. Imagine standing in the crowd as the procession winds through the city. Nero wears a toga decorated with gold thread and precious stones, while Poppaea's wedding dress is made from silk so rare that only a handful of merchants in the empire know its source. The ceremony itself combines Roman traditions with Eastern rituals that Poppaea prefers, creating a spectacle that both amazes and disturbs the watching crowds. The feast afterward lasts 3 days and costs enough to feed the entire population of Rome for a month. Exotic animals are served alongside traditional dishes. Peacocks stuffed with rare spices, flamingo tongues prepared with honey and wine, dormice fed on nuts and honey until they reach perfect plumpness. The entertainment includes Greek musicians, Egyptian dancers, and gladiatorial combats featuring condemned criminals dressed as mythological figures. But even in the midst of the celebration, you can see the darkness gathering around their relationship. Nero's love for Poppaea has become possessive to the point of madness. He assigns guards to watch her every movement, not to protect her from external threats, but to ensure she never looks at another man with interest. He interrogates her slaves about her daily activities, searching for any sign that her loyalty might be wavering. His jealousy extends to her friendships with other women, her conversations with servants, even her prayers to the gods. Poppaea, for her part, has achieved everything she wanted, but the reality of being married to an absolute ruler proves more constraining than she anticipated. Her every word is scrutinized for hidden meanings. Her expressions are analyzed for signs of displeasure or boredom. She cannot leave the palace without extensive security arrangements. She cannot receive visitors without Nero's permission. She has gained the ultimate prize, but lost her freedom in the process. The pregnancy that makes her death inevitable begins in late 64 after Christ. Poppaea conceives during the autumn, and Nero's joy is so complete that he declares a week of public celebrations. He commissions the finest sculptors to create statues of Poppaea that will celebrate her role as the mother of the future emperor. He consults astrologers daily about the child's prospects, demanding favorable prophecies and punishing anyone who suggests the pregnancy might face complications. But pregnancy changes Poppaea in ways that disturb Nero's carefully constructed fantasy of their perfect love. Her body swells and changes, disrupting the physical perfection that first attracted him. Her moods become unpredictable, sometimes passionate and sometimes distant in ways that he cannot control through gifts or attention. She develops cravings for foods that must be imported from distant provinces, sending agents across the empire to satisfy desires that seem to change daily. More troubling to Nero is the way pregnancy makes Poppaea independent of his emotional manipulation. The child growing inside her becomes her primary focus, reducing him to a secondary concern for the first time in their relationship. She spends hours with midwives and physicians, discussing aspects of childbirth that exclude him entirely. She develops friendships with other mothers among the palace staff, creating bonds that exist outside his control. For a man whose identity depends on being the center of attention, this shift in Poppaea's priorities feels like a personal betrayal. The birth itself, in early 65 after Christ, initially appears successful. Poppaea delivers a daughter whom they name Claudia Augusta, combining Nero's family name with Poppaea's own. The child is healthy and beautiful, with Poppaea's golden hair and what observers describe as Nero's intense eyes. The emperor's pride is so overwhelming that he declares the baby a goddess, ordering temples built in her honor throughout the empire. But the complications that follow childbirth reveal the primitive state of Roman medicine when faced with serious obstetric emergencies. Poppaea begins bleeding heavily within hours of delivery, and the physicians can do nothing more than apply herbal poultices and pray to the gods for intervention. Nero brings in every medical expert in the empire, offering fortunes for a cure, threatening execution for failure. But ancient medicine has no solution for postpartum hemorrhaging. You watch as the emperor sits beside Poppaea's bed during her final days, holding her hand and whispering promises he cannot keep. He swears to build her a temple larger than any in Rome. He promises to rename the city Poppaea in her honor. He offers to give away half the empire if she will just survive. But Poppaea grows weaker each day, her skin becoming pale and her breathing shallow, while Nero watches helplessly as the only person he has ever loved slips away. The death scene itself reveals the depth of Nero's emotional dependence on Poppaea. As she loses consciousness for the final time, he becomes frantic, shaking her gently at first, then more violently, refusing to accept that she cannot be awakened. He calls for physicians who have already done everything possible. He threatens the gods with revenge if they take her. He bargains desperately, offering his own life in exchange for hers. When she finally stops breathing, Nero's scream of anguish echoes through the palace corridors, a sound so primal and devastating that even hardened Praetorian guards are moved to tears. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Instead of processing his grief in any normal way, Nero refuses to accept Poppaea's death as final. He has her body embalmed using techniques reserved for Egyptian pharaohs, preserving her appearance so perfectly that she looks merely asleep. He continues talking to her corpse as if she can hear him, asking her opinion on state matters, telling her about his daily activities, maintaining the illusion that their conversations can continue beyond death. The funeral becomes a spectacle of denial rather than mourning. Nero spends a fortune on rare spices to perfume her body, covers her in jewels worth more than most provincial treasuries, and places her in a sarcophagus made from a single piece of porphyry marble imported from Egypt. But instead of burial or cremation, he installs the sarcophagus in his private chambers, where he can visit her daily and maintain the pretense that she remains part of his life. The psychological impact on Nero becomes evident immediately. He stops eating irregularly, surviving on wine and whatever food his servants can convince him to swallow. He abandons his daily routines of governance, leaving state business to his advisors while he spends hours sitting beside Poppaea's preserved body. He begins having conversations with her that grow increasingly elaborate, responding to words she never speaks, and reacting to opinions she cannot express. This is when his attention turns to the palace slaves, searching desperately for someone who can fill the void that Poppæa's death has created. But Nero is not looking for just any replacement. His grief has crystallized into an obsession with finding someone who can literally become Poppæa. Not merely resemble her or remind him of her, but actually transform into her through methods that will shock even a society accustomed to imperial excess. The search process reveals the systematic nature of Nero's madness. He orders his agents to examine every young person in the palace, male and female, looking for specific physical characteristics that match his memories of Poppæa. The requirements are impossibly detailed. The exact shade of golden hair, the precise curve of the neck, the specific shape of the hands, even the way someone walks or holds their head. Hundreds of candidates are evaluated and rejected for minor imperfections that only Nero can perceive. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. The person who eventually catches Nero's attention is not a young woman who naturally resembles Poppæa. It's a boy named Sporus, approximately 13 years old, whose feminine beauty and gentle manner remind the emperor of Poppæa's younger self. The physical similarity is striking but not exact, which means Nero will have to create the resemblance through methods that transform Sporus from a recognizable human being into a living replica of the dead Empress. The selection of Sporus reveals the depth of Nero's psychological collapse. He is not content with someone who reminds him of Poppæa or who shares some of her characteristics. He needs someone who can become her so completely that the substitution will erase the reality of her death from his mind. This requires not just physical transformation, but psychological conditioning that will replace Sporus's identity with Poppæa's personality, memories, and mannerisms. The process begins with medical procedures that modify Sporus's appearance to match Nero's idealized memories of Poppæa. Roman physicians, working under imperial command and facing execution if they refuse, perform surgical alterations that make Sporus more physically feminine. These procedures, conducted without modern anesthesia or surgical techniques, are both painful and dangerous, with significant risk of infection or death. But the physical changes are only the beginning. Nero assigns teams of servants to teach Sporus how to move, speak, and behave exactly like Poppæa. He must learn her gestures, her expressions, her way of laughing, even her breathing patterns. Every aspect of Poppæa's personality, as Nero remembers it, becomes a lesson that Sporus must master perfectly. The training continues day and night, with punishment for any deviation from Nero's expectations and rewards for successful imitation. The psychological conditioning goes beyond simple mimicry. Nero provides Sporus with detailed accounts of Poppæa's life, her thoughts, her opinions, her relationships, creating a false set of memories that Sporus must adopt as his own. He is taught to respond to questions, as Poppæa would have responded, to express preferences that were hers, to react to people and situations according to her patterns rather than his own instincts. The wardrobe prepared for Sporus includes exact replicas of Poppæa's favorite garments, made from the same fabrics and decorated with identical jewelry. But these are not costumes for occasional performances. They become Sporus's daily clothing, part of the systematic erasure of his original identity. He wears Poppæa's perfumes, arranged his hair in her styles, even adopts her dietary preferences and daily routines. The public presentation of Sporus as Nero's new companion creates shockwaves throughout Roman society. The emperor introduces him at state functions, not as a replacement for Poppæa, but as Poppæa herself, somehow returned from death. Nero's behavior suggests he genuinely believes this transformation has succeeded, that Sporus has become the woman he lost, rather than merely resembling her. But the reaction from Rome's elite reveals the political disaster this substitution creates. Senators who must interact with Sporus in official contexts face an impossible situation. They know this is not Poppaea, but contradicting the emperor's delusion means risking their lives. They must participate in Nero's fantasy while secretly planning for the political crisis this madness will inevitably cause. The daily routine that Nero establishes with Sporus demonstrates the complete breakdown of his connection to reality. They have breakfast together in the same rooms where he once dined with Poppaea, with Sporus sitting in her exact place and eating from her personal dishes. Nero conducts conversations as if no time has passed since Poppaea's death, asking about events that Sporus never experienced and expecting responses that reference memories he never formed. The most disturbing aspect is Nero's insistence that their relationship continue exactly as it existed with Poppaea. Sporus must provide not just companionship, but intimate affection, participating in private moments that recreate Nero's memories of his marriage. The emperor treats these encounters as reunions with his lost love rather than new experiences with a different person, maintaining the delusion that death has been conquered through transformation. The introduction of Sporus to state business reveals how far Nero's detachment from reality has progressed. The emperor seeks Sporus's advice on matters of governance, expecting the wisdom and political insight that Poppaea had developed through years of experience. When Sporus, still essentially a child, cannot provide sophisticated analysis of complex political situations, Nero becomes frustrated and sometimes violent, unable to understand why Poppaea seems less intelligent than before. The administrative chaos that results from treating Sporus as an imperial advisor creates the political opening that Nero's enemies need to organize serious opposition. Senators who have endured years of tyrannical rule find the emperor's latest madness unacceptable even by Roman standards of imperial eccentricity. The substitution of a transformed boy for the legitimate empress creates a constitutional crisis that threatens the stability of the entire government. But Nero's investment in maintaining his delusion becomes so complete that he begins making preparations for Sporus to inherit the empire. In his mind, if Sporus has become a Poppaea, then Sporus should have the same rights and privileges that Poppaea enjoyed. This includes not just social position, but actual political power, authority over the military, and control of the imperial treasury. The formal ceremony, where Nero declares Sporus his heir, takes place in the Senate House, with the terrified senators forced to witness and officially approve this unprecedented transfer of power. Nero presents Sporus, wearing imperial regalia, the purple cloak and golden crown that symbolize supreme authority over the Roman world. The emperor's speech explains that since Poppaea has returned from death through divine intervention, she naturally resumes her position as his partner in ruling the empire. The legal documents prepared for this succession reveal the elaborate justifications Nero's advisors create to make this insanity appear legitimate. They cite ancient precedents for unusual successions, reference divine signs that supposedly support Sporus's claim, and create genealogical arguments that trace his authority through Poppaea's bloodline. These documents, preserved in imperial archives, show how completely the imperial bureaucracy has been corrupted by the need to enable Nero's delusions. But the military response to this announcement demonstrates the practical limits of imperial authority when it conflicts with fundamental Roman values. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty ensures the emperor's survival, begins questioning orders for the first time in Nero's reign. Commanders who have followed Nero through years of increasing cruelty draw the line at accepting a transformed boy as the future ruler of the Roman Empire. The provincial governors, who control the legions that defend Rome's borders, respond to news of Sporus's designation with barely concealed rebellion. They understand that the soldiers under their command will never accept such a successor, regardless of their personal loyalty to Nero. The military foundations of imperial power begin cracking as word spreads through the ranks about the emperor's latest madness. The international implications become equally serious as foreign ambassadors report back to their kingdoms about the Roman emperor's complete break with reality. Allied nations begin questioning their treaties with an empire whose ruler has lost his mind. Enemy peoples see opportunity in Rome's weakness, beginning to plan attacks that would have been unthinkable while the empire appeared strong and united. The economic consequences emerge as wealthy Romans begin moving their assets out of the empire, recognizing that Nero's reign cannot continue much longer. Trade relationships suffer as merchants lose confidence in Roman stability. Tax collection becomes difficult as provincial administrators focus on survival, rather than sending revenue to a capital city governed by madness. But the most tragic aspect of this entire situation is the impact on Sporus himself, a child caught in circumstances beyond his understanding or control. The constant pressure to maintain the Poppaea illusion, combined with the knowledge that failure means death, creates psychological trauma that will affect him for life. He must navigate the impossible balance between satisfying Nero's delusions and maintaining some sense of his own identity and sanity. The training regimen that Sporus endures reveals the systematic destruction of a young person's natural development. Every instinct, every personal preference, every authentic reaction must be suppressed in favor of learned behaviors that match Nero's memories of Poppaea. The child learns that his survival depends on perfect performance of someone else's personality, creating a dissociation from his own thoughts and feelings that resembles psychological torture. The isolation that comes with his new position compounds the damage. Sporus cannot form normal friendships because every relationship must be filtered through his role as Poppaea's replacement. He cannot trust the servants assigned to help him because they report his behavior to Nero. He cannot seek comfort from other young people because his status places him above normal social connections, while his situation makes him too vulnerable for genuine intimacy. The physical demands of maintaining the illusion create additional stress as Sporus must constantly monitor his appearance, his voice, his posture, and his expressions to ensure they match Nero's expectations. The slightest deviation from the Poppaea template results in criticism or punishment, creating anxiety that makes natural behavior impossible. He becomes a prisoner of the role he must play, unable to relax even in private moments. The knowledge that his position depends entirely on Nero's continued delusion creates constant fear about the future. Sporus understands that if the emperor ever acknowledges the reality of Poppaea's death, the replacement will become unnecessary and potentially dangerous as a witness to imperial madness. This uncertainty about his survival makes long-term planning impossible and creates a psychological prison more confining than physical captivity. The rebellion that eventually destroys Nero begins with the military's refusal to accept Sporus as a legitimate successor. Vindex in Gaul, Galba in Spain, and other provincial governors declare their independence from an emperor whose madness has made him unfit to rule. They cite the Sporus situation as evidence that Nero has completely lost his connection to Roman values and traditions. The Praetorian Guard's eventual betrayal of Nero stems directly from their horror at being asked to protect and serve a boy playing the role of a dead woman. These hardened soldiers, who have enabled years of imperial cruelty, finally encounter something that violates their sense of honor so completely that they choose rebellion over continued service. The succession crisis created by Nero's fantasy becomes the catalyst for his downfall. When news reaches Rome that multiple provinces have declared independence and armies are marching toward the capital, Nero's response reveals how completely he has lost touch with political reality. Instead of focusing on military strategy or diplomatic solutions, he continues his daily routine with Sporus, asking for advice on matters of dress and entertainment while the empire collapses around them. The final days in the palace become a surreal tableau as Nero and Sporus maintain their fantasy relationship, while servants flee and guards abandon their posts. The emperor continues planning elaborate dinners and entertainment events that will never happen, while outside the palace walls, angry crowds gather demanding his abdication or death. The escape from Rome, when Nero finally understands that his situation is hopeless, includes Sporus, as the emperor cannot imagine life without his replacement for Poppaea. They flee together to a villa outside the city, where Nero spends his last hours still treating Sporus as his beloved wife rather than the terrified child he actually is. The suicide that ends Nero's reign occurs in Sporus's presence, with the emperor's final words addressed to him as Poppaea, maintaining the delusion to the very end. He dies believing that his love has been restored and that their separation was only temporary, never acknowledging the reality of what he has done to both Poppaea's memory and Sporus's life. The aftermath of Nero's death leaves Sporus in an impossible position. The new emperors who follow have no use for a boy whose only qualification is his resemblance to a dead woman. But they also cannot simply release someone who knows so many imperial secrets. He becomes a living reminder of the previous regime's madness. Too dangerous to free, but too visible to ignore. The eventual fate of Sporus varies, according to different historical accounts, but most agree that he never recovers from the psychological damage of being forced to live as someone else. The skills he learned for survival under Nero become liabilities in a world that wants to forget the previous emperor's excesses. He cannot return to a normal life because his identity was so thoroughly replaced that he no longer knows who he would be without the Poppaea role. The historical legacy of this episode demonstrates how personal grief, when combined with absolute power, can threaten the stability of entire civilizations. Nero's inability to process Poppaea's death naturally led to decisions that weakened Roman government, military discipline, and international standing. The empire survived his madness, but only through the collective action of people who recognized that some forms of imperial behavior cannot be tolerated. The broader implications for understanding power and responsibility emerge clearly from this story. When rulers face no limits on their authority, their personal psychological problems become public disasters. Nero's grief was understandable and even sympathetic, but his response to that grief created suffering for thousands of people and threatened institutions that had sustained Roman civilization for centuries. The treatment of Sporus reveals the human cost of enabling madness in positions of authority. Everyone who participated in the transformation, from the physicians who performed surgery to the servants who taught him to imitate Poppaea, became complicit in the destruction of a young person's life. The collective failure to resist Nero's demands, whether from fear or opportunism, allowed individual tragedy to become systematic abuse. This story also illuminates the relationship between grief and control in ways that remain relevant to understanding human behavior in any era. Nero's love for Poppaea, which appeared genuine and even touching during her lifetime, revealed its possessive and ultimately destructive nature after her death. His inability to let her go, to accept loss as part of human experience, drove him to try controlling death itself through the manipulation of a living substitute. The psychological insights available from studying this episode extend beyond the specific historical context to broader questions about identity, authenticity, and the costs of denying reality. Sporus's forced transformation into someone else represents an extreme example of how external pressure can distort individual development, creating a false self that serves others' needs while destroying personal authenticity. Standing in the shadows of the imperial palace as these events unfold, you witness the collision between unlimited power and human limitations. Nero's authority allowed him to command almost anything except the one thing he wanted most, the return of someone he had lost. His attempt to create that return through transformation and substitution demonstrates both the seductive nature of absolute control and its ultimate futility when confronted with the fundamental realities of human existence. The young boy who became Sporus, caught in circumstances beyond his control or understanding, represents all the innocent victims of powerful people's inability to accept the constraints that govern everyone else's lives. His story reminds us that behind every exercise of absolute power, there are human beings whose lives are shaped by decisions they never made and consequences they never deserved. These buried voices from history's shadows deserve to be heard not because their suffering was unique, but because it reveals patterns of power and control that persist across cultures and centuries. The methods change, but the fundamental dynamics of how grief becomes obsession, how love becomes possession, and how authority becomes tyranny remain constant aspects of human nature that we ignore at our own peril. If this exploration into the darkest corners of imperial Rome has revealed historical truths that challenge your understanding of power and its consequences, consider subscribing to continue this journey through history's buried archives. There are countless more stories waiting to be told, voices that have been silenced by time and circumstance, but deserve to be heard by anyone willing to confront the full spectrum of human experience. The emperor who tried to conquer death through transformation ultimately learned that some losses cannot be replaced, some grief cannot be avoided, and some forms of love are too possessive to sustain the very thing they claim to cherish. His legacy stands as a permanent warning about the dangers of an unlimited authority and the human cost of refusing to accept the natural limits that govern all our lives.